When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Hey, I'm Frank, and I have hidradenitis suppurativa, HS. Before starting Cosentyx, I was so uncomfortable with my symptoms, like not being able to sleep on white sheets or wear white clothes. Now I can appreciate the little things.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa, HS. Don't use if allergic to Cosentyx. Get checked for TB before starting. Increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like TB or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms, like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if IBD symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
You're stronger than HS. Ask your dermatologist about Cosentyx.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustral implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder,
a podcast where we actually listen to our listeners who are telling us about their experiences in the mad world.
This week, you are giving us the orders with your listener questions. We're going to start with Gaza, Palestine and Israel, dabble a bit in Russian and American symmetry, and close things out with a search for the real ordering policymakers, if they exist.
Ooh, yippee, Jane, I can't wait to get started.
Hooray! So, Jason, we're going to start with a question from Sarah R. And Sarah's question is, forgive my ignorance, but I'd like to know why a UN peacekeeping force cannot be deployed to the West Bank to protect its beleaguered inhabitants from being attacked in their homes, on their land, from overzealous settlers. There must be an obvious answer, which is staring me in the face, but I cannot fathom it.
There's a very obvious answer here, Sarah. The Israelis wouldn't allow it. They have what they consider sovereignty over the West Bank, and there would never be a UN resolution that they would accept, and America would veto any UN resolution. Jane, could you tell us about the precedents of UNFIL, for example, at the Lebanese border, or other UN peacekeeping forces? They've generally come about at the end of wars or as a result of an international treaty, and then Russia and the US have both voted to allow them.
Well, a peacekeeping force needs to have a peace to keep. And this has been something that comes up in discussions about Ukraine as well, when there have been talks about a European-led peacekeeping force, but it's impossible to progress those talks without a picture of what a peace agreement would look like, because otherwise you don't know what you are defending. So, yes, the UN Security Council would not authorize something because of the US veto. There isn't a peace to keep. But there is a question here. What happened to the so-called responsibility to protect, which got something of a bad name over Libya, but is something that the UN was thinking about for quite a lot of years? How do you try to find ways to protect civilians if the government in charge of that territory and those civilians won't do it itself. And I think even if this kind of question was brought up at the Security Council, it would be interesting to see how it might affect Israeli strategic thinkers. Not that it's going to become a reality in the foreseeable future because of the geopolitics.
I don't think R2P makes sense in the Israeli case. I mean, to talk very openly, Sarah, about the situation in the West Bank, the reality is that the Israeli government can't even control its own settlers. Yes, there are settler parties in the government, and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are giving a wink-wink and nod-nod to some of these very aggressive settlers doing illegal actions. 100%. But as we've seen from 1967 to the present, when the Israeli government tries to crack down on these settlers, they do illegal things. It's a very complicated problem, right? We've had anti-settler left and center-left Israeli prime ministers who have found that they can't face down the settler lobby. It has lots of private money from the States. It has passion from people in Brooklyn and from the Russian Jewish diasporic communities. And this is a very difficult nut to crack. I've always been very against the settlers because I feel that they cause danger for the Israeli population who was born there and lives inside the Green Line, and they just want to get on with their lives and, do their art or work in their high-tech firm, right? And they're like, why should I have to worry that my kid's bus is going to blow up? And part of that reason is because there's this settler enterprise happening 20 kilometers to the east that they didn't vote for and they can't control. It's a very complicated issue, Sarah, and I don't think that it can be solved in the absence of the solution of the whole Israel-Palestine conflict. And I know that that's not what you want to hear, but I think that there could be some horse trading about the governance of Gaza, acknowledging a Palestinian state, getting the Qataris and Saudis to demilitarize Gaza, pony up for its reconstruction, where we would have a kind of nouvelle Oslo that would demarcate where Palestinians can govern themselves in the West Bank and where there have to be territorial swaps. And this is nothing new. It goes all the way back to Camp David and Oslo, but that's what I'm going to say. How about you, Jane?
Well, I think I'd frame it in somewhat different terms, but it is also linked to the solution of the conflict, which, and I think here, like, the issue is the ongoing occupation, which the International Court of Justice has said is illegal, but which most Western countries aren't really doing very much about because they have alliances themselves with Israel, not only the US alliance. At the end of the day, this is a fundamental problem, which is why there is this violence and impunity in the West Bank. And Palestinians ultimately are calling for their own ability to govern themselves rather than calling for an international peacekeeping force to come and protect them. So that will also bring us rather neatly into our next question, because, of course, we have a lot of questions from listeners about this conflict. And David H. has written to us to say, I would love to get your thoughts on various nations announcing their intention to recognise Palestinian statehood. I will try to be brief. I am sick of hearing these sorts of declarations. They seem to me so lacking in detail or any hint of the how, where, who governs or who funds that they border on trite. I don't hear or read any analysis in mainstream media that really calls Macron, Starmer et al. Out on this. That is to say, is it unreasonable to question them along the lines of, great that you are making a statement, but what about the and? So, I would love to jump in on this one, Jason.
No, he addressed it to me first. It was very clever. Jane didn't read that the questioner said, Dear Jason.
Dear Jason.
Yes. So, David H., preach on, preacher. I couldn't agree more. And Jane and I are going to have slightly different views here. I'm also fed up with hearing these one-sided, entirely irrelevant, we recognize Palestine, or we plan in September at UNGA to recognize Palestine. I think it's unbelievably counterproductive. Anthony Blinken had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he said in better terms what I essentially believe. I want there to be a Palestinian state recognize that you will give a declaration that you think there should be a Palestinian state conditional on Hamas disarming and giving the hostages back, or the Palestinian Authority or other Palestinian bodies saying Hamas and anyone who's, committed terror actions will have no role in that state, or a million other conditionalities. Then it's an earned thing. It's not an inalienable right, even however you look at the 14 points of Wilson and the Atlantic Charter. The Palestinians don't have an inalienable right to a state. Talk to the Kurds. Where's their state? They had to give up their terror and liberation struggle because it hasn't worked. So there's no inalienable right to a Palestinian state because, again, and I mentioned the Kurds, but what about the Uyghurs and what about whatever? And this isn't whataboutery. This is about concrete diplomacy. I want a Palestinian state. So make a declaration if you're Macron or Starmer saying, these are the conditions. You want my support. Do A and B and C and D. And it does shock me, David, that there is no conditionality. This is the exact same mistake that Sharon made with the Hitnatkut, the withdrawal in 2006 from Gaza. It was a very courageous statement. And, I'm someone who was opposed to Sharon, but you got to give it to him. He said, we can't govern this hostile population. We're just going to withdraw. But it was unilateral. He shouldn't have withdrawn without an agreement, without some kind of negotiated solution. And this, to me, is the mistake that Macron and Starmer are literally caving into some crazy protesters who don't understand diplomacy. You can't reward terror in this way, and you can't have a deal when you don't have a counterparty. So it's like, great, we acknowledge a Palestinian state, but there's no counterparty that we're acknowledging that with. Crazy.
So Jason and I totally disagree about most of this, but where we do agree is that simply having a declaration of recognition isn't enough on its own without being linked to other measures to resolve the conflict. I believe that Palestinian statehood is fundamental to addressing the root causes of this conflict, and that Western governments are right to try to address the causes. They would obviously prefer statehood to come out of a negotiated process, but they can also see that is not going to happen. And they're dealing with an Israeli government that has said that it will not ever allow there to be a Palestinian state. They have already recognized the inalienable right of the Palestinians to statehood, which is one of the things that makes it different from the Kurdish issue, because Kurds already exist within other states where they have citizenship. So we've already got to this point for decades now, where the world has promised that there will be two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, but hasn't delivered on the Palestinian state and has basically sat on its hands while the peace process drifted and nothing happened. So this is about trying to jumpstart a return to a process that ends in two states. Now, what are the alternatives? I mean, there are not that many alternatives, although you can come up with different variations on them. There is the idea of having both peoples share a single state, and that can essentially either look like a state with equal rights, or it can look like an apartheid-like state. Or there are ideas, and there are people that will advocate this on both sides, that one side will take over all the territory and basically throw the others out. But that is horrific.
Also, it's not going to happen.
I don't think it's unimaginable. I mean, I think that the amount of displacement that we're seeing in Gaza.
Okay. But nuclear war where we genocide ourselves and the human population is also possible. That to me seems about as likely. My issue, Jane, is we both want a two-state solution or a three-state solution. I'm okay with three states, but the Palestinians need to have a state or two states. Whether it's Gaza-istan and West Bankistan or Palestine, that's great. It's about how do you get there? It's not going to happen by, leaders in European capitals declaring that there's a state of Palestine, when the reality on the ground is that this is literally the furthest that there has been from the Peel Commission until now to there being a Palestinian state. So this is like the most absurd moment to declare it. Why didn't you declare this, back in 1993 when there was at least a reasonable chance of having it?
Well, it's precisely because they think that actually Palestinian statehood might be permanently prevented by the creation of facts on the ground,
But then they should do things to
militarily.
incentivize the Israeli and Palestinian peoples to take another course. I have long advocated for ways to use European diplomatic leverage, one, to get Netanyahu out of power, and two, to change the Israeli approach both to the war in Gaza and to the disastrous settlement enterprise, which hurts Israeli interests, it hurts Western interests, it hurts Palestinian interests, it hurts Muslim interests. In other words, what's this declaration in thin air when there is concrete policy that's sitting in Macron and Starmer and Albanese's hands that they could do to move towards the 2-state or 3-state outcome, but they're not doing it. They're just making a stupid declaration.
So the declaration is linked to wider measures. And this is all still, of course, live and being worked on. And I have no idea if any of these measures will be enough to change the calculations of the parties, especially the current Israeli government, which isn't listening to what Europeans are saying. But, this is part of a multilateral, coordinated effort to support a transitional government in Gaza that would be under the umbrella of the Palestinian Authority. So, I think David's point is no one is communicating like who is being recognized, who governs. Well, it hasn't.
Exactly, that's my point.
It's both of your point. I mean, it's what's in his question. And in fact, this has been set out, but it hasn't been communicated clearly at all at the UK government level. But people should read in the show notes the New York declaration of the recent UN conference on a 2-state solution, which does set out the idea of a transitional government for Gaza under the umbrella of a Palestinian Authority and with international support. This has been coordinated by France and Saudi Arabia, and it's part of the same package as the recent Arab League statement that condemned the 7th of October and called on Hamas to disarm. So there is quite a deep misunderstanding of what is going on here. It's not a reward for Hamas. It's being coordinated with the Arab world in a way that weakens Hamas and strengthens the Palestinian Authority.
I disagree there. So it's a reward for Hamas because they were potentially on the verge of having to give up the hostages and agree to some kind of ceasefire. But, what do you know? Macron just said there's the Palestinian state. Let's not. We're going to pull out from these negotiations. So again, it's a question of how you see these things. And I think that we each can't understand how Hamas leadership thinks, but we both have reasonable insights into it, right? My years in Syria, I spent time in the West Bank and in Gaza. I talk to Palestinians. I read in Arabic what's being written, and you do as well. And I don't have a better insight than you, but I have an equally valid one. 100% from my perspective, they see these declarations as, why should we give in now? We're not going to have to surrender. We can ride this out. It doesn't matter how many humanitarian catastrophes there are here. It only makes our case stronger.
Hamas have claimed credit for the recognition. They have said this was an achievement. I don't think that we should accept that narrative as the be-all and end-all of what is actually happening here.
But some Palestinians do accept it.
Palestinians have various views on this. Obviously, they want statehood. There are many things they also want more urgently. And the view that I'm hearing more often from Palestinian civil society is a concern that the recognition of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state won't change things in reality, and that it will be another way of basically restating lip service to a 2-state solution that won't come. So actually, I think there's a lot in common with the criticisms that you've set out at the beginning, and there is an onus on Western diplomats to make this something that is real. But ultimately, the statehood of the Palestinians can't be endlessly deferred, and there needs to be a way to put down a line with the Israeli government that the population of Gaza needs to stay there. They have people from South Sudan in Israel currently for consultations about moving people from Gaza into South Sudan because essentially they want to get rid of them. It's at a very, very extreme point, which is why going back to waiting for negotiations isn't going to work.
My critique with the Europeans here is they have so much power and leverage, they just don't know how to use it.
Well, that's true. We can all agree on that.
Trump and Putin are having this summit in Anchorage, which I entirely oppose. Putin should not be allowed on sovereign U.S. territory. It's a shambles. Why can't the Europeans have a summit where they have all the Europeans together with Zelensky and they have a phone call with Putin, a secure phone call, where they parlay with him? But they haven't done it. Do you know what I mean? So why can't we have Macron and Starmer going to Doha, meeting Netanyahu and some Hamas and Palestinian Abu Mazen PA people, promising the mega billions, having the Saudis donate this and do that, and getting a deal, rather than making some statement, when the statement, to my mind, actually obviates the real diplomacy.
On the Europeans and Russia, I totally agree. They just missed a possible moment for that. The 31st of July was the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, which was a joint declaration between NATO countries and the countries of the Warsaw Pact and some non-aligned countries to have a common set of principles for security and cooperation in Europe that over time led to the formation of the OSCE and some common ground again among countries that have never fully agreed ideologically. That 50th anniversary would have been a natural moment to have that kind of summit. The Europeans are confused right now. On one hand, they are saying we want to be at the table with Putin and Trump. On the other hand, they're saying there's no point in negotiating with Putin. So you can't really say both things. And Trump's not going to bring you into the table, so you've got to build your own table. I agree on that. I think there's definitely more that the Europeans could do in terms of summitry on Gaza as well, and that working closely with the Saudis on that is super, super important. I think that bringing Netanyahu and Abbas together is something that neither Netanyahu or Abbas will agree to, and that's probably one of the reasons that this hasn't happened.
Great. Well, then get Ehud Olmert or get Naftali Bennett or, who might be the next prime minister. I have said that Biden had the ability to get Bibi out. If he had flown to the Knesset on October 9th, given his speech and said, given that Bibi has presided over the greatest security failure in Israeli history, more so than 1973, he's got to go. I would like to see 5 Likud members call for the no confidence vote. And then if this works out, we're going to have $400 billion that we're going to be giving into the Israeli tech sector and more, student visas and whatever. Oh, we've worked out with the Saudis who are going to do this, that, and the other on the Gazan side. There's just a million things that could be done. So I want to move on to another question. I'm sorry if I come across dismissive, and I don't want there to be any perception of a gender dynamic in my approach as kind of more military and Jane's is more peacemaking. I want peace as much as Jane. I feel what David feels, just a frustration. Like, oh my God, more bloviating when people are dying and starving and then there's chaos. And I just don't want more bloviating. Let's have the rubber meet the road. So moving on to Rachel's question, which is in the same vein.
Now Netanyahu has announced his plans to occupy Gaza. How do we get any closer to a real solution? I agree with Jason's plan for the Strip, but I just cannot fathom a way to get there. Who is the key to making it happen?
Well, Rachel, thank you both for your support of my plan and for this excellent question. God, my heart sunk when I heard about this reoccupation of Gaza. It's like, obviously, I think that there is a humanitarian and a moral crisis in Gaza. Denying access to humanitarian aid or leveraging food supplies, it's not only illegal under the Geneva Convention, it's immoral, and it doesn't seem to be gaining anyone anything. And we need to think about the Palestinian families and ordinary Gazans and children who are suffering. Of course, we see pictures of them. We don't really know the context, but we know people have lost their homes twice, 3 times, and been moved back and forth. And no matter what their views on Hamas or their views on October 7th or their views on the Palestinian Authority, This is unacceptable, and it's a war crime. And I don't think we need to presage decisions of an Israeli military strategy with expressions of sympathy for the Palestinian people. But just as everyone has to say moral outrage about October 7th before then condemning Israel, of course, what Palestinian civilians have been made to suffer is unacceptable and it's immoral. I don't buy for a second that they're finally going to root out Hamas. I mean, not that I am oppositional to looking at some Israeli objectives in a reasonable light, but please, you've got to get rid of Netanyahu and the people around him and try another approach. Like, maybe the Israeli public should say, great, if this doesn't work within 3 months, we're having this election. We've got to get rid of them. I thought that there was already this crisis about the ultra-Orthodox parties who quit the coalition because they don't want to have the yeshiva students be conscripted, and we could see the government collapse. That's what I was really hoping for, and we could have a new approach. So, Rachel, you're right. We are the furthest away from what I would like to see happen, from what Jane would like to see happen, that we've ever been. People are obviously starving in Gaza. They're being shot at aid distribution centers. It isn't great for Israel. It isn't great for Jews globally. It isn't great for the stability of the world. And literally, it's like we're stuck. This is the enduring disorder in microcosm, whereby the pressures to just make it worse and go forward, because we're doing it this way, we're going to do it this way. And the ability to rethink seems impossible.
It's a horrible, horrific situation. And that's partly why we're just having this discussion about recognizing a Palestinian state. It's not going to be a panacea because there are no panaceas. Lots of things need to be done. I find it really remarkable that over the past couple of weeks, every single former chief of the Israeli army, the Israeli intelligence services, and the Israeli police have come out opposing the plan to reoccupy all of Gaza because they can see that it's a complete dead end or worse. There are many, many protests inside Israel, and yet it still doesn't seem like there's anything to stop it from happening.
This is the problem with populist leaders. If Trump said tomorrow, Jane, it's terrifying, right? Let's say that Trump said tomorrow, I am going to change the entire tariff structure that we've just negotiated now, and we're going to have 93.7% tariffs here and this, that, there. Oh, and we're not honoring the Constitution, and I'm not following through on the equal protections law and whatever. What's going to happen? Are the Republicans going to impeach him? And is the Supreme Court going to actually do anything? America is a democracy, but when you have a lunatic who has his own personal reasons, whether it's distracting from Epstein or in Netanyahu's case, wanting to stay in power and his court cases, I really don't know what the answer is here, except to get these guys out of power, because our systems, the U.S. and Israeli system, have tended over their histories to concentrate power more and more in the executive. This is more covered in the question of the executive presidency in the U.S., whereby even though Nixon abused that power, we've seen a trajectory from Reagan then all the way through to Clinton to W. Bush of the increasing of power in the executive and the inability of other branches of government to check that power. I don't understand Israeli history as well as I understand American history, but I know enough to say that their Supreme Court was that counterbalance, and it's been weakened. There has been a process whereby power is more and more concentrated in the executive, and I don't think that there's an answer other than to get the leader who is going against the core tenets of the country out of power. Am I missing something?
And we've got this situation where the power is really concentrated domestically in the hands of a leader in both the US and Israel. And these are also both countries that are not very constrained by the international system. So the confluence of those things together are creating all sorts of problems. And, you know, there are many people saying what's happening in Gaza is a failure of multilateralism, but it's really a failure of unilateralism. You know, it's the absence of multilateralism. It's not that multilateralism is there and isn't working. It's that it's not there. And a very tiny number of people are making decisions that then have dreadful effects very widely.
And those tiny number of people don't have the incentive structures of their nations.
Absolutely. It's personal interests.
We were talking about the concentration of executive power, but we also have to talk about culture here. There is an extent to which contemporary Israel has gone off the deep end from Jewish culture historically, and even Israeli culture from its foundation. Israel has become a place where people say davka, which means in spite of. So everyone says that we can't do this, we'll do it. Everyone says that it's against humanitarian law to do this, well, we're just going to do it. Or we can solve this problem this way. We solved this tech thing. We made the desert bloom. We did this. We're the ones who, essentially invented the chips behind NVIDIA. So they say that we can't occupy Gaza, we're going to do it. And that's something which is bold and creative and great about Israel in various cultural and tech contexts, and horrible and horrific in various humanitarian contexts. So that the ability to do the great success in Iran with minimal civilian lives relative to what it could have been is probably connected to the reason why there's this humanitarian absolute catastrophe. I want to tell the mega ordering listeners a story when I was in Monaco and I had a run-in with a Israeli backgammon player right after his army service. And he behaved badly and was extremely rude, but he also violated the rules of the game and justified why he was able to violate those rules. And I think it's a fascinating story that I'm going to put in the pay for Substack, because this is kind of explosive material. And I have been known to defend Israel more than most people on the center left. So for pay for members of the Substack, you can get my story rather biting into some of the failures of contemporary Israeli culture. So please check out the link to the Substack, join the pay for, and I think you're going to enjoy that story that I'm going to share with you there. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to an interview I did on BBC 5 Live. This was about the Trump-Putin summit, whereby I think Trump makes his actions vis-a-vis his own interests, not American strategic interests. And Netanyahu may say that he is Israel, but he isn't Israel. He's making these decisions in his own interests.
So that brings us to a question from Simon S., who says that he loves the podcast. Thank you very much, Simon. But he wants to know, in brief, does Trump's meeting with Putin actually mean anything? I feel like without the Ukrainians involved, we're no closer to a true solution than before.
I just want to point out to the listeners, we're recording this on August the 13th, Wednesday. The summit is happening on Friday, the 15th. So we're just bloviating in advance. Before kicking it over to you, Jane, may I be the 98th pundit this week to give the silly quote, "When you notice that you're not at the table, you find out that you're on the menu."
Yum, yum, yum.
And sadly, Zelensky and the Ukrainians, as well as the Europeans, have found out that they are getting munched on in Anchorage because they are going to be screwed.
And we've seen the Europeans very anxious about that bilateral relationship between Trump and Putin. Perhaps it will not be the kind of love-in that Europeans initially feared when Trump first came to power, because it will have become apparent to Trump that Putin is able to play him, that Putin's not going to rush to give him the route to the Nobel Peace Prize, right? But on one hand, you do actually need the US and Russian leaders to talk. It was vitally important for the end of the Cold War and the prevention of nuclear war that Reagan and Gorbachev were able to have a good personal relationship. And we know that Trump looked up to that and admired that and saw that as a kind of cool way to be a leader, doing the big man stuff in the important rooms. On the other hand, we are looking at a situation where Trump is barely consulting his own diplomats or his own Russia experts, who he thinks are all part of the deep state that have conspired against him. NATO allies feel generally excluded.
Jane, did you know that when you get admitted into Oxford or you're ready to do your PhD at the University of Chicago, you sign a little thing. Will you be loyal to the deep state and to the secret conspiracy therein? As soon as you get your Russian or Arabic to the requisite level and you write an academic book and everyone signs this, it's just secret. So
Absolutely.
could you tell?
I mean, the deep state must be really deep in the US, so deep underground that like it's completely invisible and
And you know
entirely
what's fascinating
ineffective.
is that there are crazy left-wing Pakistani communists and right-wing neocons that sign the same thing. And they're equally loyal to the conspiracy. I just didn't know if you knew that.
Everyone is in on it. Absolutely everyone. I think that's absolutely right. And hopefully this will really boost our YouTube ratings, Jason, because conspiracies are obviously the zeitgeist right now.
So back to the meeting. I want to give Trump his due. I mean, it's difficult, but he achieved certain things in Iran, and he could get Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza in a way that Biden might not have been able to. He hasn't heretofore, but he did get the first ceasefire. So I think that Trump's very unpredictability does allow him to achieve something with Putin. If he has a master stroke up his sleeve, he may have some kind of ace that he hasn't played. I don't think he's going to because he's kissed Putin's boots the whole time. And like I've said with Arthur, it is not clear what you would do differently if you were a covert Russian agent or a person that they had compromat on that Trump hasn't done. But all of that being said, he could surprise us and actually leverage Putin. And this summitry is an opportunity for him to show that he may have some juice. Right, Jane?
I think if we're looking at a best case scenario, we know that Putin really doesn't want to let go of Ukraine, but he does also want other things that the US can give him. You know, this invasion of Ukraine and the huge amount of propaganda about it, it's partly about revisionism and expansionism and his wrong belief that Ukraine is his. It's also about
Ukraine
Russia's...
is mine!
It's mine! But it's also about Russia's, and therefore, in his thinking, his status as a great power in the world and the degree to which it's respected and acknowledged by the US. And in some ways, he will be a bit optimistic that Trump will give him some of that. That changes the calculations when it comes to using Ukraine to prove that NATO is weak and divided, because there are other ways to prove that NATO is weak and divided. I mean, I don't want that to sound overly defeatist, but, you know, it does change the calculations that it doesn't necessarily need to be part of an endless confrontation with it between two superpowers, which is also bad for the world, although a very close relationship between the two superpowers is also worrying for Europe. Now, there's been some interesting writing in the run-up to this summit about the idea of a framework agreement being put forward, which would provide a sort of scope for potential Russia-Ukraine talks. We've seen Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia, who ended their conflict with the FARC, write about this in The Economist. And we have seen Thomas Graham from the Council on Foreign Relations write about this recently as well. Both of these articles are quite well informed by voices from all sides, and I think are worth looking at. We'll put them on the show notes. Very briefly, though, it would likely involve some things that everybody can take home to say that they have won, including Putin being able to say, NATO is going to stop expanding into my backyard, something that Trump wants to do anyway. Probably some kind of kicking the can down the road on the resolution of the territorial disputes, some kind of sanctions relief for Russia, and some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. They're not going to solve these issues quickly, but the idea would be to set this agenda so that there are some parameters for real talks to get going if enough energy is put into keeping at it, which we don't know if the US is really going to do. After the break, we order the disorder with you, the mega ordering listeners who are asking about where on earth can we find sensible ordering policymakers.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
This is history's heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone, including a pioneering surgeon who rebuilt the shattered faces of soldiers in the First World War.
You know, he would look at these men and he would say, "Don't worry, Sonny, you'll have as good a face as any of us when I'm done with you."
Join me, Alex von Tunzelmann, for History's Heroes. Subscribe to History's Heroes wherever you get your podcasts.
We are back, and we have questions from mega orderers. What does Kim F. say, Jane?
Hi, Disorder team. I love being a mega orderer. We love you being a mega orderer too, Kim. Kim says, I look around most Western states and wonder about where the sensible orderers are. Can you give me a ray of hope? How do we get global coordination back? Jason, you're always a ray of hope.
This is actually a question that we've had on every question and answer session dating back to 2023. Thank you, Kim, for expressing it very succinctly. I'm going to say 2 or 3 different ways that this might happen. Top down, bottom up, and then massive social movement. Top down is we need to elect new leaders and we need to have new thinkers propounding new visions. I am going to say publicly that I was too optimistic about Starmer.
Oh, Jason, you were his last fan.
I was told by ex-girlfriends to my left and ex-girlfriends to my right that I was wrong, that I had mistakenly understood the man and that he wasn't going to be a bold leader. He was going to be a kick the can down the road, Biden-style, ineffective quasi-technocrat. And I do think he's done some good things, but he wasn't the mega orderer in chief that I hope that he might be. It may be non-traditional politicians entering the political arena, academics, cultural figures, philosophers, who are going to articulate new ways of doing politics. Have we seen it yet? No. But I don't think it's likely to be a Gavin Newsom-style politician, and it might be more likely to be a Buttigieg or a bottom-up style person getting a top-down level position. Do I think that Mamdani and people of his ilk? No, I think that that's too counterculture and it's too many failed left-wing, rent-free style stuff. So there aren't many rays of hope, but it doesn't mean that they can't emerge. Merz seems okay in Germany. It seems like he's doing stuff. He changes his positions on Israel. He's supportive on one thing, and he's very opposing on another. And he's willing to change on various defense spending things. So that's the top down. The bottom up, I don't think that street protests are the answer, but join a movement, have a discussion group, donate to a charity, go to your local church, mosque, synagogue, have a group, and focus on the issues that you believe in. Donate to the Substack of the people that are saying the things that you're interested in. And then in terms of alternative politics, I am open to the idea of there being a mass movement, something akin to a new religion where people say, we have too much time on our smartphones. No one can have a conversation anymore. This isn't the world that we signed up for. We don't believe in the billionaires getting all of these fruits of these technological things. We demand something new. And I'm going to write about this. My next book that I'm already working on with my agent is about what a movement might look like, a movement of mass orderers.
We hope you'll be part of it, Kim. And I'm going to bring in our final question from Brian L. And do you know what? I have been thinking about this question because it's such an interesting and big one. He says, seeing the real impact of misinformation in policy, I'm thinking of RFK's plan to stop vaccine funding here based on little science but lots of conspiracy theories. How do we get back the sensible centre, facts-based policy making? I fear we have gone too far down the rabbit hole to get back.
I can't escape the rabbit hole.
Come back, Jason!
Well, I think that you're correct, Brian. And we talked about this with Julia Ebner in her great two-parter on extremism. Jane, why don't you go first here?
I think this is such a huge and interesting question. And again, there is a top-down and bottom-up part to it. You know, there are things that we can all do to try to be skeptical, vigilant, use good sources. But that is because we are trying to genuinely learn and understand things. Whereas it seems that there is a trend in politics for telling people certain things that those constituents want to hear that has nothing to do with evidence and nothing to do with science, and so far isn't backfiring, but surely will backfire at some point. I mean, I would have thought in the past that medicine would be one of the last frontiers where science-based and evidence-based policy won through. And the tragic thing about the vaccine conspiracies is that it's going to take quite a long time for the full effects of what's happening now to be seen. Yes, we are already seeing certain diseases coming back, but there will be a time lag, which means that it will be a while before there is the counter movement and perhaps some attempt at accountability. But we really need to understand why people are buying this stuff, why it makes them feel good to believe that medicine is all a lie and that these alternative things are going to work much better. I don't have the full answers to it, but at some point it's going to be obvious.
I have some perspective here. I think that what Brian is pointing out is the world has changed so rapidly. Some people have benefited so much financially or structurally or economically from these changes. The mind says there must be a reason behind all of this. Of course, there isn't. There was no reason behind the invention of the internet or some magical secret hand in unleashing the pandemic. Just shit happens, right? But people think that it's happened for a reason or that someone is pulling one over on them. And we can go back to when I was in Claxton-on-Sea and I interviewed, surreptitiously, of course, the campaign manager for Farage. And he was like, you know, it's all the World Economic Forum. They control all the lithium and they've made up climate change. They're benefiting because with these ULEZ zones and all this other things, they make so much money on their lithium batteries. And I said, great, well, who's making all the money? And he's like, the global elites. And I was like, well, who are they? George Soros and Sadiq Khan.
Wow. That's
said,
who runs the world. I get it.
George Soros and Sadiq Khan. George Soros is like pretty dead. I mean, he may not be actually dead, but I hear that he can't like leave his room. He's in his late 90s. And Sadiq Khan is not much of a private businessman. I don't think he has many lithium mines.
They must be somewhere down there with the deep, deep state, right?
Yes. But I think that gets at it, Brian. People just are searching for answers. They can't grasp how there have been all these changes. Oh, there must be a conspiracy where the Jews are letting the migrants in through Mexico to weaken the white race. But then they're also letting them cross the channel from France. Makes perfect sense, right? So people are too far down this rabbit hole. And it comes back to Kim's question. We're going to need a real mega orderer who can do amazing communication. I think that it would be useful if there were breakout influencers in the policy space who could explain the complexities of these issues in a non-BBC Radio 5 style format that people could get into. And they could be like, oh, wow, that's why it's difficult to assimilate these migrants. Or that's why the state lacks the capacity to process all the people who come over seeking asylum claims. Because the misinformation war is so difficult to fight back against. BBC Verify isn't going to do it. It needs to be people who are doing what you and I are doing, but in a much more pop cultural and soundbitey way. And the reality is we're just too old, Jane.
Well, you've really cheered me up there, Jason. But do you know what? I am old enough to have kids, and I do think there is a reaction against screens and everything being on YouTube from the younger generation. I certainly hope that's true. I see it anecdotally. We are going to see the current 12-year-olds being able to vote in the next election in the UK.
God.
So how kids process information when they are digital natives and when places like YouTube are completely unregulated for political campaigning and advertising, that is a whole other interesting thing that is going to come. But I also see young kids saying, I don't like seeing my friends' older siblings on video games all day. I don't like them watching AI brain rot and that being all there is with no stories and no facts and no learning. So this is super important. We've got to encourage this among the next generation.
They should also play real games, like, for example, backgammon. It's a physical game. You just have a tactile experience of it. Why play like Wards of the Worlds or Lords of Minecraft with a joystick? You can play ball and go to the tennis court and like bike your bike and play like normal things. Am I missing something, Jane?
We're going to build all this into the movement. But I do think, there is a reaction against just living virtually and just being atomized. There is a desire. I mean, kids are also getting back into like upcycling vintage clothes. Kids like to buy 12-inch vinyl records. These are reactions against what the previous generation prioritized.
You know what they should take up is the loom. Not just sewing, but I want, if I had kids, that they really become experts at the loom, that they sit there and like, we have a little cottage industry in the basement and they're spinning yarn on this loom.
Look, we'll be there in another couple of generations after the nuclear war or the societal collapse or whatever it is that's going to happen. Then, Jason, we can get the looms back out.
So then it won't be that bad because we can just sit around and make yarn and like weave rugs and stuff. I would like that.
Looking forward to it, Jason.
Well, that was more than enough from me.
Well, that is it for this week. Thank you for your questions, and please do send us more of them. disordershow@gmail.com is the contact. We'd love to hear from you. If you too want to help order the disorder, please rate the show. And yes, you should give us 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps others discover us.
Don't forget about our YouTube channel too. You can see me being tired and yawning while I'm doing this talking. If you want to see these conversations, but you also really want the exclusive extra videos, subscribe to the YouTube channel. The link is in the show notes.
And finally, for more on today's topics, we have a Substack too. The link is also, guess where? In the show notes.
And as I promised, you're going to hear about my interaction with the young Israeli man and what his wanting to defy the rules of backgammon I saw as a metaphor for the Israeli relationship to international law. So please check out the Substack and then upgrade to the paid Substack for this very special content. Our producer is, as always, the mega orderer-in-chief, George McDonagh. Disorder is a part of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for questioning. And we hope you have an orderly week.
Yeah!